The claim did not arrive with documents. It arrived with timing. In a carefully staged broadcast interview, Tom Bower suggested that a long-suppressed detail about the birth of Lilibet Mountbatten-Windsor was no longer confined to rumor. A witness, he said, had finally stepped forward. Not a source, a witness, someone present, someone with proximity, someone willing to speak. The implication was explosive, not because of what was said, but because of what was left unsaid. Within hours, palace monitoring intensified. Advisors in California scrambled. And at the center of it all stood Meghan Markle, facing a question she did not publicly answer, and a silence that quickly became its own accusation. Today, we examine what Bower claims to have uncovered, who the alleged witness is said to be, why the timing matters, and how a private family moment became the latest front in a public battle over credibility, control, and consequence.
Exciting breaking news to share for all of you, as the Duke and Duchess of Sussex have just announced the birth of their daughter. It is the second child for Prince Harry and Meghan Markle.
The moment landed not with evidence, but with emphasis. During a broadcast interview, Tom Bower chose his words carefully. He did not say he had uncovered proof. He did not say he had documents. He said a witness had stepped forward. In investigative language, that distinction matters. A source can speculate. A witness implies presence. Within minutes, producers clipped the segment. Headlines followed the phrasing rather than the substance. A witness. Finally. The suggestion alone was enough to reopen a conversation that had been dormant but never settled. The subject was the birth of Lilibet Mountbatten-Windsor, a moment that had always been treated with unusual restraint by both palace and press. Bower's reputation gave the claim lift. He is known for constructing narratives that rely on accumulation rather than revelation, implication rather than disclosure. Supporters call it methodical. Critics call it provocative. In this case, the impact was immediate. He framed the alleged witness as someone with proximity, someone who had not spoken before, someone whose account, if aired, would change how the story is understood. He did not say how. In California, the reaction inside Montecito was swift. Advisors began calling one another before the interview finished airing. According to people familiar with the discussions, the first question was narrow and urgent. Who is he referring to? The second was broader. What does witness mean in this context? Medical, administrative, institutional. Each possibility carried different risks. Meghan Markle was briefed in stages. Friends described a visible tightening rather than an outburst. She asked for specifics that no one could provide. There were none. That absence did not calm the room. It heightened it. Vague claims are harder to confront than precise ones because they cannot be cleanly denied. The timing mattered. The story surfaced without warning, outside any legal proceeding, unanchored to a book release or court filing. That gave it the appearance of spontaneity, even if the preparation was deliberate. Media analysts noted the choice. A claim without a deadline invites speculation to fill the gap. Across the Atlantic, palace monitoring teams flagged the interview within hours. At Buckingham Palace, aides circulated the transcript, highlighting key phrases. Witness stepped forward. Finally, the language was assessed for intent rather than content. This was not an accusation. It was an invitation to question.
That's going to have a reaction from the palace. We still haven't heard it yet, even though this is a couple days old. Alex?
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack here. And let me tell you, as the mother of two children,
The palace was divided quickly. One faction argued that the claim should be ignored entirely. Birth details, they said, had been handled appropriately at the time, and revisiting them now would only dignify rumor. Another faction worried about the optics of silence. The word witness, left unanswered, could harden into assumption. Doing nothing risked letting implication become context. In Montecito, Prince Harry joined the conversation later in the day. Those present described his reaction as guarded rather than angry. He focused on process. Who exactly is making the claim? Where would such a witness have been? What, legally, can and cannot be said by people present at a birth? The answers were technical and unsatisfying. Confidentiality rules are strict. So are professional ethics. But ethics do not stop speculation. Media coverage widened as the day progressed. British tabloids leaned into confrontation, framing Bower's remark as confirmation of long-held doubts without specifying what those doubts were. American outlets were more cautious, emphasizing that no evidence had been presented. The divergence did little to slow the cycle. The phrase, "new witness," traveled intact across both markets. Advisors in California debated response options. A flat denial risked anchoring the rumor. A statement about privacy risk could sound evasive. Silence risked being read as something else entirely. The antagonist here was not Bauer alone. It was ambiguity amplified by repetition. Meghan's concern, according to those close to her, centered on credibility. She had always understood that some critics would never be persuaded. What troubled her was the possibility that neutral observers might begin to question something that had never been publicly contested. Births are usually sacrosanct. Once that boundary is crossed, reclaiming it is difficult. Harry worried about a different angle. He had spent years arguing for his children's privacy. This claim threatened to pull his daughter into public debate without her consent. He asked whether the palace might quietly clarify procedural norms around royal births abroad. The answer from London, relayed carefully, was non-committal. The palace would monitor before acting. By evening, Bauer's comment had taken on a life of its own. Panels debated what a witness could plausibly mean. Some speculated about hospital staff in Santa Barbara County. Others suggested administrative figures involved in documentation. None offered evidence. The speculation itself became the story. Inside the palace, the factions argued again. One aide warned that allowing this narrative to grow unchecked risked eroding trust in official processes. Another countered that engaging would only invite further probing. The king was briefed late, given options that ranged from absolute silence to generic reassurance about procedures. No decision was made. Delay itself was a choice. As night fell in California, the mood inside Montecito was tense but contained. Meghan chose not to respond publicly. Harry agreed. The calculation was painful but deliberate. Speaking now would not end the questions, it would formalize them. By the close of the first day, nothing concrete had emerged. No witness had been named, no account had been shared, yet the ground had shifted. The birth of Lilibet, once treated as a private family moment, was now framed as an unresolved subject of inquiry. That shift did not require proof. It required only suggestion and silence. This was how the story reopened. Not with facts, but with framing. Not with revelation, but with implication. And as both palace and family weighed their next moves, one reality was already clear. Once a private moment is recast as a public question, it rarely returns to its original form. By the second morning, the language had hardened. What began as an interview remark was now being treated as a development. Commentators no longer asked whether Tom Bauer had evidence. They asked who the witness was and why they had waited. That shift mattered. It shifted the story from conjecture to expectation, even though nothing new had been added. Bauer's phrasing continued to drive the cycle. He did not clarify. He did not retract. He allowed the ambiguity to work. In investigative storytelling, the word witness carries legal gravity without legal obligation. It implies proximity while avoiding specificity. The antagonist at this stage was not a claim. It was a definition left deliberately open. Inside Montecito, advisors mapped scenarios. According to people familiar with the meetings, they broke the possibilities into categories. A medical professional was present during the birth. An administrative staff member is involved in paperwork. A peripheral figure who observed logistics rather than care. Each category carried a different exposure. Each also came with barriers. Medical confidentiality laws are strict. Hospital records are sealed. Administrative processes are standardized. None of this prevented speculation from flourishing. Meghan Markle pressed for clarity that could not be delivered. Friends described her frustration as focused rather than emotional. She wanted to know what could plausibly be alleged and what could not. Advisors explained the uncomfortable truth. Plausibility is subjective in media cycles. If something sounds possible to an audience unfamiliar with procedure, it can gain traction regardless of reality. The conversation turned to locations and dates. Santa Barbara County hospitals were mentioned repeatedly in coverage, often without naming a specific facility. That vagueness irritated advisors because it allowed imagination to roam. They discussed whether naming the hospital publicly would help or hurt. On one hand, specificity can ground a story. On the other, it can invite unwanted scrutiny of staff who cannot respond. The decision leaned toward restraint. Prince Harry approached the issue from a different angle. Those present said he focused on ethics. He asked what professional obligations would prevent a genuine witness from speaking publicly. The answer was clear. Anyone with legitimate proximity would be constrained by confidentiality. That realization deepened his concern. If a true witness could not speak, who exactly was being referenced? Across the Atlantic, palace discussions intensified. At Buckingham Palace, aides convened a structured review rather than an informal check. The escalation underscored sensitivity. Births, particularly of children with royal titles, sit at a junction of privacy, protocol, and public interest. Missteps linger for decades. The palace split into familiar factions. One group argued for procedural clarification. A neutral statement explaining that overseas births are handled through established legal channels, without naming individuals or circumstances. The other group warned that such a statement would be read as defensive, effectively validating the premise that something required explanation. The disagreement was sharp but controlled. British media leaned into confrontation. Tabloids speculated openly about who the witness could be, running lists of hypothetical roles without naming anyone. American outlets were more restrained but no less curious, inviting legal analysts to discuss what a witness might legally disclose. The repetition of the question did the work. Each segment reinforced the idea that something was to be uncovered. Bauer remained silent. That silence amplified his earlier words. Observers noted that he neither corrected misinterpretations nor narrowed the field. In the ecosystem of investigative commentary, silence after provocation is often strategic. It allows others to build the narrative for you. Inside Montecito, the human cost sharpened. Friends described Meghan as increasingly concerned about the long-term effect on her daughter. The idea that Lilibet Mountbatten-Windsor might grow up with her birth treated as a subject of public doubt unsettled her deeply. This was not about rebutting a claim. It was about protecting a child from a narrative she could not consent to. Harry shared that concern. He asked whether the palace might step in to shut down speculation for the sake of the child. The response from London, relayed carefully, was cautious. The palace would not comment on individual births beyond what had already been recorded. Any further engagement risked expanding the story rather than containing it. The antagonist now shifted from Bauer to momentum. Media cycles thrive on unresolved questions. Each hour without clarification widened the gap between what was known and what was assumed. Advisors debated whether a controlled leak of procedural information could slow the cycle. The idea was rejected. Leaks invite counter-leaks. The fire spreads. By afternoon, legal counsel weighed in decisively. Any statement that referenced a witness, even to deny one, could invite legal action or compel a response from third parties. Silence, though uncomfortable, remained the safest path. This was not about winning the day's coverage. It was about minimizing long-term exposure. Palace aides reached a similar conclusion from a different direction. Engaging now would invite future claims framed similarly. If the institution responded to the implication, it would be expected to respond again. The monarchy does not operate well under open-ended obligations. As evening approached, the tone of coverage shifted again. Commentators spoke less about discovery and more about credibility. They debated whether the absence of clarification undermined trust. That framing was dangerous because it placed the burden on silence rather than on the claim itself. Meghan felt that burden acutely. Friends described moments of anger followed by resolve. She understood that no explanation would satisfy those inclined to doubt. The risk was losing neutral observers to suspicion through sheer repetition. She asked advisors how long such cycles typically last. The answer was unsatisfying. They last until attention moves on or until a definitive counter-event occurs. Harry recognized the pattern too. He had seen it with other stories. Silence becomes evidence by default, yet speaking can entrench the narrative. The choice is never clean, it is strategic. By nightfall, no witness had been named, no account had been shared, no document had surfaced. Yet the phrase, "witness steps forward," had embedded itself in the story's spine. That embedding changed the stakes. It suggested inevitability. Something was coming, even if nothing ever did. Inside both Montecito and Buckingham Palace, the same conclusion took hold. The story was now less about facts than about expectation. Managing expectation would require patience, restraint, and acceptance that some questions linger longer than answers. As the second day closed, the silence held on both sides. It did not calm the storm, it redirected it. The narrative was no longer asking whether there was a witness, it was waiting for one. And in that waiting, pressure continued to build, setting the stage for a confrontation not with evidence, but with belief. By the third day, the story had moved beyond speculation and into structure. The question was no longer what Tom Bower meant when he said a witness had stepped forward. It was who, institutionally, had the authority to shut down the narrative and why no one was doing it. That absence of permission became the new center of gravity. Inside Buckingham Palace, senior aides approached the situation as a containment problem rather than a communications one. Births involving royal children, particularly those born outside the United Kingdom, sit in a procedural gray zone. There are protocols, but they rely heavily on trust, discretion, and professional ethics. Once those processes are questioned publicly, correcting the record becomes far more complex than issuing a denial.
And joining us now from Buckingham Palace is NBC Royals commentator and journalist Daisy McAndrew. Daisy, it's great to see you.
The palace factions split again, this time along sharper lines. One group argued that the institution should reclaim authority by outlining the procedural reality of overseas royal births, not specifics, not locations, just a reminder that documentation, medical oversight, and legal recognition follow standardized frameworks. Their concern was erosion. Allowing the implication of irregularity to stand could undermine confidence in systems the monarchy depends on. The opposing faction disagreed vehemently. Any clarification, they warned, would function as an admission that clarification was needed. The monarchy has survived centuries by refusing to litigate private moments in public forums. Once it begins explaining, it invites interrogation. This camp believed the wiser course was distance. Let the claim exhaust itself without institutional oxygen. The disagreement reached senior levels, but no directive was issued. The palace defaulted to its most reliable instinct: delay. Delay creates space. Space often dissolves urgency. In this case, the delay also indicated that the institution did not consider the claim legitimate enough to warrant a response. In California, the silence from London was read with mixed emotions. Prince Harry understood the logic, but that did not soften the impact. Friends said he felt caught between two worlds. Too royal to be ignored by critics, too distant to be protected by protocol. He asked whether the palace's silence meant quiet confidence or quiet concern. No one could answer definitively. Meghan Markle experienced the silence differently. Advisors described her frustration as focused on the agency. Decisions about her daughter's birth were now being discussed without her participation. She had no platform that could address the claim without amplifying it. The imbalance was stark. Others could imply. She could only react or remain silent. Neither option restored control. The press sensed that imbalance and leaned into it. British tabloids framed the palace's silence as strategic avoidance, suggesting there was something to avoid. American outlets framed it as institutional indifference, suggesting abandonment. Both interpretations led to the same outcome. Silence became meaningful regardless of intent. Bower's role evolved again. He did not repeat the claim, but he did not retreat from it. That posture allowed commentators to treat his words as settled context. Panels debated implications rather than accuracy. In media ecosystems, repetition without correction converts assertion into background fact. The alleged witness narrative hardened through that repetition. It was no longer introduced as a claim. It was referenced as something pending, a revelation yet to come. This rhetorical shift was crucial. It transformed uncertainty into anticipation. Anticipation sustains attention far longer than disclosure. Inside the palace, one senior aide summarized the risk in a private note circulated among decision-makers. If this becomes about permission to question births, it does not end here. The note highlighted concern that validating this line of inquiry could invite future scrutiny of other private moments. The monarchy's survival depends on keeping some doors closed permanently. The king was briefed again, not on the content, but on the consequences. The choice was stark: intervene and set a precedent, or remain silent and absorb criticism. He chose the latter. The brief tensor. From an institutional perspective, criticism fades faster than precedent. In Montecito, Advisors discussed whether third-party experts could be encouraged to speak about medical confidentiality and legal process in general terms. The idea was to introduce friction into the narrative without directly involving the reader. It was rejected. Orchestrated commentary risks exposure. Exposure breeds escalation. The human toll continued to rise. Friends described Meghan as increasingly protective of her inner circle, limiting conversations and exposure. Harry became more guarded, less willing to speculate even in private. Both understood that words, once spoken, would be reinterpreted endlessly. Silence, though painful, at least limits variables. By late afternoon, coverage shifted again. Analysts began asking why Bauer would introduce such a claim without elaboration. Some suggested leverage. Others suggested timing tied to unrelated events. The speculation widened, but it no longer centered solely on Meghan. That diffusion offered slight relief. When stories widen, they often weaken. Inside the palace, aides noted the shift and held course. No reaction, no clarification, no anonymous briefings. The institution would not grant permission for this narrative to advance further by acknowledging it. As evening approached, the story entered a holding pattern. The alleged witness remained unnamed. No account emerged, no document surfaced. Yet the implication persisted, sustained by repetition and the absence of authoritative contradiction. This was the most dangerous phase. Not eruption, but endurance. Stories that linger without resolution embed themselves into public memory, available for reactivation at any moment. Both sides understood that reality. In London, patience was policy. In California, patience was survival. Neither guaranteed relief, but both recognized that intervention now would likely deepen the wound rather than close it. By the end of the third day, the battle lines were clear. Bauer had introduced the suggestion. The media had amplified it. The palace had refused to authorize it. Meghan and Harry had chosen silence over engagement. What remained was not a claim waiting to be proven, but a question waiting to be answered by time itself. And time, in stories like this, does not always favor the truth. By the fourth day, the story had settled into its most enduring form. Not a breaking revelation, not a refutation, a narrative that existed because it had not been closed. In public life, unresolved questions often outlast answers, and this one had already begun to harden into reference material rather than a headline. Inside Buckingham Palace, senior aides reviewed the trajectory and reached a quiet consensus. Engagement now would not resolve anything. It would validate the premise that private births are open to public arbitration. The monarchy has survived by drawing firm lines around certain moments. Births are among them. The institution chose to defend the line, even if doing so attracted criticism.
I have to tell you, I was a little surprised by the birth. Usually you hear a little bit of, oh, there was somebody going into the hospital, somebody saw this, but there was no indication.
The palace factions that had debated distance versus clarification found rare alignment. Silence would continue, not because there was nothing to say, but because saying anything would expand the scope of inquiry. From an institutional perspective, explanation invites interrogation. Interrogation invites precedent. Precedent reshapes power. For Meghan Markle, the cost of that choice was personal. Friends described a shift from tension to containment. She stopped tracking every mention and focused on protecting her immediate world. The concern was no longer the claim itself, but its longevity. A question that lingers can attach itself to a child's identity long before the child can understand it. Lilibet Mountbatten-Windsor had become a symbol without consent. That reality unsettled both parents. Birth is meant to be definitive. Once doubt is introduced, even without evidence, it changes how a story is retold. Meghan understood that no statement could restore what repetition had altered. The goal shifted from correction to insulation. Prince Harry confronted a familiar limitation. Outside the institution, he had argued, privacy would be easier to protect. The opposite proved true. Without palace authority to draw boundaries, every silence invited interpretation. He recognized the paradox. The monarchy's restraint, which once felt oppressive, now appeared as a form of protection he no longer possessed. Media coverage reflected this new phase. Analysts spoke less about discovery and more about impact. The alleged witness was referenced as a pending element, even as days passed without emergence. That rhetorical framing mattered. It suggested inevitability without requiring evidence. The antagonist was no longer a person, it was anticipation. Tom Bower remained largely out of view. His earlier words continued to do the work. Commentators cited him as the origin without pressing for follow-up. In modern media cycles, initial framing often matters more than subsequent silence. The absence of elaboration did not weaken the claim, it preserved it. Inside the palace, the king was briefed one final time with a simple assessment. The story was no longer accelerating, it was stabilizing. That stabilization signaled the correct course had been chosen. From an institutional standpoint, enduring criticism is preferable to creating a permanent exception. The decision would not be revisited. In Montecito, advisors recognized the same shift. The acute phase had passed. What remained was management. Avoid amplifying the narrative. Choose public moments carefully. Emphasize normalcy without overcorrection. This was not a surrender. It was a strategy shaped by experience. Public reaction was divided predictably. Some viewed the silence as dignified restraint. Others interpreted it as confirmation of doubt. The divide itself ensured longevity. Stories that split audiences tend to persist, resurfacing whenever conditions allow. Meghan accepted that reality with quiet resolve. Friends described a determination to keep moving forward without expecting vindication. Vindication requires a forum willing to listen. This story had moved beyond forums. It lived in implication. Harry reached a similar conclusion. He understood that the palace would not intervene, and that asking again would change nothing. The boundary had been drawn and held. His focus narrowed to what could be controlled: family routines, future planning, shielding his children from narratives they did not choose. By the end of the week, the story had become part of the background, not resolved, not disproven, simply present. That presence was the consequence. In public life, permanence often arrives without proof. The antagonist, in the end, was not a witness who never appeared, or an author who never elaborated. It was the space between silence and suspicion, widened by repetition and sustained by curiosity. Once that space opens, closing it requires more than facts. It requires time, and time is not always kind. This is how private moments become permanent public questions, not through revelation, but through refusal to let them rest. The palace chose containment. Meghan and Harry chose endurance. The story chose neither. It lingered, reshaped by implication, waiting for the next moment it could be summoned again. In royal life, some boundaries are defended by silence, others are tested by it. And when a private moment is recast as public doubt, it rarely returns unchanged. In royal life, silence can protect, but it can also provoke. If you want deeper investigations into how witnesses, words, and timing reshape public truth, subscribe, share your thoughts, and join us as we continue unpacking the stories that refuse to stay private.